Modal theory is often seen as more complex than it actually is. By the end of this video, you should at least have a clearer understanding about what modes are and what differentiates them from standard scales. Modes can be seen as scales within a scale. That's why modes are often referred to as modes of a particular scale. For example, we have modes of the major scale, which is the modal system we're going to look at now. So we start with the major scale. This is the parent scale from which 7 modes will be derived. Why 7? Because there are 7 tones in the major scale, and each tone provides the root note of a new mode. These are often referred to as starting notes. For example, the second tone of the major scale is the start of its second mode. The 5th tone is the start of the 5th mode. No matter which tone you start on, the intervals of the parent scale remain intact from that position. So, starting with the first tone of the major scale, this marks its first mode, known as Ionian. As we're starting on the first tone, this first mode will just be the same as the major scale itself. However, we still give it a modal name when using it in a modal context. The second tone of the major scale marks the root of the second mode, known as Dorian. If we start on Dorian's root and continue through the major scale from this point, we get a feel for Dorian's flavour. We'll look more at the individual tonal qualities of these modes later. Continuing, the third tone marks the root of the third mode, known as Phrygian. The fourth tone marks the fourth mode, known as Lydian. The fifth, Mixolydian. The sixth, Aeolian. And the final tone of the major scale, the seventh, marks the seventh mode, Locrian. So we're effectively building scales on each degree of this parent scale. Aside from the first mode, we're no longer using these major scale tones to create a major scale sound, even though the overall interval structure remains intact. By creating these 7 starting points, we can now identify 7 modes of the major scale. Separately, they have their own unique qualities. They are scales in their own right. Starting again with Ionian, we have a major scale. Dorian, minor. Phrygian, minor. Lydian, major. Mixolydian, major. Aeolian, minor. And finally, Locrian, which is the odd one out because of its diminished flavour. Because each mode is effectively an individual scale, you should see their tones in relation to their root rather than the parent scale's root. For example, if we take Mixolydian, the 5th mode of the major scale, and lay out its intervals from that 5th degree, the 5th now becomes the root or the first tone of that mode. This means the 6th will become the 2nd, the 7th will become the 3rd, etc. However, notice how the major scale's intervals still remain intact. We've just shifted the starting point up to that 5th tone. Incidentally, Mixolydian is characterized by its flat 7th interval, which is what the 4th of the major scale becomes when transposed to its 5th mode. So, if you want to get an idea for the flavour of each mode, simply start from that mode's root in its parent scale. This means if you've already learnt the major scale, you'll automatically know its 7 modes. The only thing left to do is getting confident with identifying these starting points and being able to isolate a particular mode in your soloing. You can learn more about these modes individually with backing tracks and in-depth theory on fretjam.com. So, what determines when we should think and play in modal terms? While individual scales can be applied over individual chords, modes are applied over a sequence of chords that lie within the same modal system. Going back to the major scale, Each of its modes also build associated chord types. For example, as the fourth mode Lydian is a major mode, it'll build major chords. The sixth mode Aeolian is a minor mode, so it'll build minor chords. These chords can use some or all of the tones from their related mode. As well as building scales on each degree of the parent scale, we're building chords. The root note of each mode becomes the root note of their related chord. This gives us a chord scale, still based around the intervals of that parent scale, but now we're building chords on these intervals. If we start on the note C, therefore C Ionian will be our first mode, we can build the chord scale from this point, remembering to associate the chord type with its related mode. C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, and B diminished, and then back to C major again. Of course, this interval pattern is movable in the same way that the major scale is across the fretboard. It all depends on the starting point. Numerals are therefore often used to represent these chord relationships without alluding to specific key. From this chord scale, we can build modal chord progressions, and we'll look at this concept in more depth in the next part. Cheers.